Good evening. I will open the January 22nd public meeting of the Newton Planning Board, and we will start with a salute to the flag.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
First order of business on our agenda is that we're going to review the stormwater management regulation changes. And Jen has given us an updated, clean copy, and she has some questions in some areas, I believe.
Yep, so I apologize for not getting this to you until, I think, 2:30 this afternoon, but we'll just go over this generally. As you may recall, I was doing a few tweaks from the last time because there was an updated version of the model ordinance that came out that actually addressed some of your concerns that we had worked through and cleaned up many of the typos. So this version has incorporated all of our discussions from over the summer. It's reduced some of the verbiage a little bit per the updated model regulations from the Southeast Watershed Alliance. It basically just makes it a little bit cleaner. It doesn't change the intent of it. But I have tweaked things per your request to clean up a few of the language. We do have a few areas that are in bold and in brackets that I want to have discussion points with you on. Some of them are minor, some of them are a little bit more involved. But the intent was just to kind of go through this as a whole regulation right now, if that works for people, and if you've got questions as we're going through, we can do that. But once everybody's had a chance to really read through it, and if you have comments, one of the reasons I included the line numbers is so that we can reference it a little bit easier.
That's why you did it. Why she did that.
Because why does, I don't know, line 300, what does that mean in relation to line 27, that kind of stuff.
Right.
I think it's easier, personally.
You'll love that.
I did not strike out everything that I removed. I only struck out very big sections that I thought might have impact in the way you want to incorporate things into this. So this is really as clean of a version as I could get to for your review.
Okay.
All right. That said, the very first paragraph is really just descriptive. That's completely struck out. Folks felt that that was a little bit redundant with what is now section A, purpose and goals. So the other thing I've done with purpose and goals is I took off a lot of that struck out area, and we brought in for the very first sentence the clause that's in your existing stormwater regulations, which is development shall not increase, decrease, modify, or alter the normal patterns of stormwater drainage caused during the development of a site and or by the eventual development itself. Basically, runoff happens from sites naturally. You don't want to change that. You want to keep the volume and the amount that it can naturally run off the same. You don't want to increase it, and you also don't want to cause things to stay on a site when they naturally would run off, say, into a stream or a creek, because you want to maintain that volume as well. So we're just basically reiterating that point, but bringing it from your current regulations forward. Doesn't really change the intent of all of this at all, but I think clarifies it and keeps it a little bit more digestible for everybody. The 5 goals and purposes, those are from the model. They basically say we're going to make sure that point source is being cleaned up, we're not increasing discharges, we are infiltrating as much as we can, and we are actually trying to protect the quality of surface waters and groundwater. Section B, which is the minimum threshold of applicability, this is one of those areas where you had actually requested me to reverse some things because you wanted the information that is actually in 2 to come forward, but some of the cleaning up of this actually, it didn't make sense to do that change, so I ignored your comments basically and didn't do it. So under B, the minimum threshold for applicability. So someone comes in with a site plan application, because these are only for site plan regulations. If they are going to disturb more than 5,000 square feet, so that's about 1/8 of an acre, or if they're going to disturb more than 2,500 feet within 100 feet of a surface water body. You don't have a lot of surface water bodies in town, but this would mainly apply to Country Pond. Then, under 2, when can someone actually receive a waiver from these regulations? So these regulations would not apply for things that are agriculture in nature. If you are doing basic resurfacing of roads or parking lots, because parking lots tend to be a big impervious surface, but if you're not changing the quantity of impervious surface, you're not changing the runoff even from developed sites. Or if you're doing anything to the exterior, interior, that's just maintenance of buildings and structures. It basically streamlines who does this not apply to. Things that aren't changing stormwater, this doesn't apply. They would need to ask for a waiver, but because of the way this is written, it's very obvious what activities would not then be required to come in with a stormwater management plan. So we're keeping with the 5,000 square feet. This is the one, so this is all under B. That's the one area where most towns have the most discussion. Are we talking about disturbance areas of 20,000 square feet, which is half an acre? Are we talking about disturbance areas of 10,000 square feet as a quarter acre? The reason, when these were originally drafted a number of years ago as a model ordinance, the suggestion was at least have it be projects of 20,000 square feet disturbance. If you're gonna go with nothing else, have it be that. Alteration of terrain takes care of projects that are 100,000 square feet of disturbance. That's about 2¼ acres of area that would be disturbed on a site.
I have a question
Oh,
for you.
yep.
Since you said what we're going over now is mostly applicable to commercial,
It is only applicable to commercial and multifamily.
isn't 5,000 square feet a small area that maybe we should think about a larger area?
Well, so there are two schools of thought on that. The reason, when the model ordinance originally came out at 20,000, is the idea that at least the big projects you would capture. The things that have occurred down on Puzzle Lane would come under this. But some of the other projects that fall under your minor site plan typically probably wouldn't be captured in this. When some analysis was done in both Durham and in, I want to say it was Stratham or Newmarket, they were looking at building permits that were issued over the course of a couple of years to see what was the threshold, what size projects were actually being captured by a 20,000 square foot impervious surface coverage and what was not. When you get down to about the 10 to 5,000 square feet, you're actually capturing about 80% of the projects that are coming in.
Okay, so this
the
allows
mo-
you to
so the-
capture
yeah.
more projects.
The more
Okay.
projects you're capturing, which means that you're having more projects deal with their stormwater,
Which is a
which
good
is
thing.
better for the water
Okay.
quality, but you're also balancing, but it's also going to cause development to have a little bit more of a hurdle to get over because they're having to deal with managing their stormwater. So it is a balance. Many towns will go with 15,000, some will go with 10, some will go with 5. The few that, when they first started adopting this, were going with 15 or 20. So 10 is probably where most towns end up settling on, but those were towns that were doing this before the MS4 permit actually came into being, and some of those towns were fighting that permit and some were not. The most conservative for protecting water quality is going smaller. So this 5,000 square feet. If you want to balance people's ability to develop their site with minimal impediments, then a little bit larger maybe is the right call. You can always, I would start, if you feel cautious that 5,000 might be too much, go a little bit higher. You can always make it smaller. It would be hard to have it go smaller and then say, this is capturing too many projects, let's go bigger.
Why would it be more difficult to change it that way than the other way?
It's not, I don't want to say more difficult. I think it would be less palatable to most business owners. Because if they came in at 5,000 and then you decided to change it up to 10,000, then they just complied with a regulation, but now you're letting other projects of similar size go through, if you were to change it that way, versus making it a little bit stricter going the other way. So that's just, I mean, that honestly, that's a little bit of a political feasibility. But going smaller from the beginning, you capture everybody, everybody's being treated the same.
Right.
I'm not personally a big fan of changing the rules on people all the time. If you're gonna change them, and then go forward.
Right.
So I have a question on B on that same one.
Yep.
So a surface water body, is there a definition of that, like how big it has to be?
A surface water body would not include a wetland. It would include a brook, a stream, country pond.
That's a general definition that people would know or go by.
Streams are always running, or you got intermittent streams?
Generally, that would be taken under state law as a perennial stream, not an intermittent stream. We can define that if you want to and put it in the definition section of your site plan ordinance. You do have a definition in your zoning of surface water, which is probably what we would fall back on.
What about culverts?
Culverts would not be surface water bodies.
Okay.
They're stormwater detention basins. They don't even typically even qualify as a wetland.
So surface water body is a natural water body.
Is a natural, yeah.
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
So under B2, that's the waiver portion. C is basically outlining what are the stormwater performance measures for when you are having new development. That means someone's coming in for a project, there's either nothing on the site or it is such a major project, and they have the, we'll say, the space to be able to do a variety of upgrades to their building. Basically, it is emphasizing doing low-packed development, which I have gone through, and I think I caught everything. There are almost no acronyms in here, or they are spelled out. There are also no websites listed, but the references, for example, the DES Stormwater Manual or updated version is referenced in here. It is a technical manual. You need that in here, but it's not just listed with a website. So
Good.
that was also made. I also did not include a list of acronyms because I took all of them out. So there is no appendice that has that. It does emphasize that there will be stormwater management and erosion control practices shall be located outside of buffer zones. Low impact development site planning strategies must be used to the maximum extent practicable. All stormwater treatment areas shall be planted with native planting. This was actually one of the changes you had requested. That only native plantings can be used when you're doing stormwater. Before it just said natives or similar, basically. Effectively not invasive. When you were doing things like salt storage, you are having them not able to just infiltrate into the groundwater. Surface water should be directed to stormwater control measures to filtrate them. It's usually total suspended solids. Nitrogen and phosphorus are the big things that you're looking to get out of stormwater, which technology can range between about 20% for some of those, up to 80% for total suspended solids. Basically, you slow it down, you can get the suspended solids out of it, or if you have vegetation that's part of it, they can uptake those nutrients. All newly generated stormwater shall be treated on the development of the site. Runoff from impervious surface shall be treated to achieve at least 80% removal of total suspended solids, 50% of nitrogen and phosphorus. This is largely running, if you will actually turn to the very last page. So C5, one of the big things that is used to actually do some of the calculations when you're doing volume is you're using what is the design criteria in the very back. This is all based on soils, it's based on how much rainfall you've gotten. This is taken directly from the DES Stormwater Manual. This is the gold standard that's out there. It was published in 2008. It's likely due to be updated. All of the references in here say this manual or the updated version. So you don't have to understand all of the formulas, but that's what the design standard is based off of.
Well, that would be for whoever it is, the engineer who's developing the
Yes.
stormwater management plan for these
And
people.
I will say, these regulations are becoming the typical, especially in this part of the state because of the MS4 permit. The stormwater manual that's used, anybody that's ever done an alteration of terrain permit, of which most of the engineers you guys see have done alteration of terrains, this is what they're using. So this is not anything new. It's just the threshold or the size of the project it's applying to. Six just gives guidance as to what post-development runoff should look like. So when we get certain rainstorms of certain frequencies, how much water volume are we talking about that you then need to deal with and treat? Basically, how big do your stormwater infrastructure, detention ponds and box filters, how big do they need to be? This is the first area on line 94, where I do have a question. Typically for a post-development runoff peak, that's so how much water is coming off, you would do that in a 2-year storm interval, a 10-year, 25, or 50. We had talked about 100-year storms. Those are very difficult from a design perspective to design infrastructure for. There is a certain point when you have enough volume raining, even the natural landscape is going to shed more water than it can possibly ever absorb in a rainstorm. It doesn't mean it is infeasible. I just said it was difficult to do a 100-year storm. Most towns do not require that level of volume to be captured on site and treated because it simply becomes too much. So for this one, I was going to run it through Mike Vignali and get his input as to whether or not we do the 100-year. So that's the reason for that sort of question mark.
I've been through a couple of 100-year floods in Phoenix, Arizona. Nearly took Phoenix off the map. So you don't even want to think about 100 years.
Well, at least here, we've had in the past 10 years in the range of 500 and 1,000-year storms.
Right.
Now, what constitutes a 100-year storm, which is actually...
Biblical.
Well, a 100-year storm is inaccurately named. It's more of a 1% storm. So in every given year, you have a 1% chance of having that intensity of a storm. So it really should be a percentage storm rather than a year, sort of like we talk about 100-year floods. The same principle applies. But when we have those 500 or 1,000-year storms, we get things like the Mother's Day flood or the Patriots' Day flood where half of the seacoast can't get to the other half for weeks at a time.
Yeah.
So,
Okay, so you're going to check that with Mike and
Yep.
see what he says, all right?
but I wanted Roger to know I had not forgotten his comments.
We have, yeah, good.
Number 7 is just that basically stormwater infrastructure needs to not flood onto streets and other adjacent properties. It needs to account for upstream and downstream gradient and natural runoff, and whenever practicable, native site vegetation should be used. Those are the basic situations that we would design stormwater infrastructure for. Those are kind of the principles, so 1 through 9 sort of fit that. The actual requirements for what would be included in a stormwater management report and plan really falls under 10. This is the meat of what would be submitted. So, A, you need to include a plan. We'll start with basics. B, and this is actually an upgrade from what used to be in these model ordinances, is actually providing a narrative description. The reason for doing that is because I am not an engineer. None of you are engineers that I'm aware of. Code enforcement officer, not an engineer, although he certainly knows what is what I'm looking at for a stormwater infrastructure, is that what is supposed to be there? That's the reason for having a narrative description.
That's good.
It's not just a pretty grassy area. No, what's it supposed to be for? So that's the purpose of it.
That's good. So that we can understand it too.
Yes. And this all says, including GIS coordinates and providing all of the detail that you have in your site plans for a lot of other things, providing that in the plan. C, again, is this sort of narrative of describe the general approach and strategies for implementing what is actually so section 723A and C. 723 is your stormwater criteria for as we're proposing it, as to what the purpose of all of these low-impact design strategies are. You guys typically don't see the pre and post stormwater calculations that get submitted from your site plans, although they are always submitted. Mike gets a copy, you retain a copy on file. I usually get a copy if it's a digital file. That's looking at what calculations are being used to determine how much runoff naturally comes off of the site due to slope and other water bodies. And then when they're going to build something, what is that new drainage pattern and volume going to be? So that's what D is, it's those calculations. And those you're already provided for, so that's no new information you're asking for.
I'm assuming that narrative would go in the front of the stormwater booklet that we normally get.
Yes, and typically the narrative can also be on the site plan as one of the details.
Okay.
So you have a details sheet as to what that's going to look like. That would be one of those details. It doesn't have to, but it's nice to have it all captured in, at least that the executive summary version of it, I guess, is the way to put that.
Well, I was just going to say, some of those booklets are, you know,
The actual stormwater management plan could be more or less a booklet, but the practical installation details, the maintenance and operation details can all be on a detail sheet in a site plan. You wouldn't record that sheet, but you would
Right.
have it in the detail sheet.
and actually, we do usually, I've seen some that have come in as parts of plan sets.
Yep. Through E and F, this is really a description of how you're actually going to limit areas of disturbance, how you're going to construct the stormwater management. F is actually the inspection and maintenance plan, so we'll get to that in a little bit farther on, but that's the kind of detail you would put on your detail sheet. Describe any locations where you may have snow storage areas or de-icing. That's because salt as a pollutant, you want to know where that's going to be loaded, and is that going to be, just as an example, discharged directly into a grassy areas where you're going to put all of your salty snow that you're storing. Well, it's just going to kill the grass, and then that's not going to be able to take up the nitrogen or the phosphorus. And H is actually very applicable to Newton because you have such a large area that is in the MS4 program. And what that is saying, you don't actually have a chloride or a salt impaired water body, but if you were to, this gives a little bit more teeth that you can actually require someone to come in and actually use best management practices for salt storage per the MS4 permit. You don't have that problem right now. This just institutes it if you were to suddenly have a water body that's impaired for salt. So, and that they update the impaired water bodies list every 2 years based on water quality data. It's feasible that that would happen. You don't have anything that's in the immediate adjacent area, but. So in item 11, this is basically the performance standards. What is all of this infrastructure going to do? What is the post-development reduction going to be for actually minimizing discharges, for dealing with keeping any of that polluted water out of wetlands, and actually developing that the discharge will be contributing to increasing the water quality. C basically I have an indentation problem there. Sorry about that. C is talking about how you're actually going to capture and reuse water on site. You're trying to infiltrate as much of the stormwater generated on the site as much as you can, but at a certain point, there is that amount of water that you still want to go off the site because it naturally already was. You don't want to starve a water body from its water volume it would have actually had without any development. D is all of the performance standards and the criteria for the design. E is just sizing. This is really what precipitation models did you use to calculate your stormwater volume. You may recall when I gave a presentation, I think a year ago or so, I showed you the different water volumes based on what is historic precipitation data, and then using what is current precipitation data, what constitutes that 100-year storm. There's more water in a 100-year storm now than there was 50 years ago. You want that so that they are using the correct volume of water falling on your site when they're doing their 2, 10, 25, 50, and maybe 100-year storm calculations. F is really speaking to when you're going to have things like rain gardens or bioretention, which is a fancy word for a big rain garden. How are you actually going to maintain the landscaping? With bioretention or rain gardens, one of the very key factors, anything that is using vegetation to take up some of those nitrogen or phosphorus loads, is you actually have to maintain the vegetation. Sometimes that means you need to take it out when it dies and plant new things. Sometimes that means you need to make sure that whatever species you're using is either salt tolerant because it might be near a snow dump, or it's okay having very wet feet all the time because it might be flooded for a day or two periodically. So it's making sure that landscaping is going to be maintained and who's going to maintain it. At the end of the day, it's the property owner's responsibility. Now, of course, they could always have somebody that they have given that responsibility to, but legally, it would still always be the property owner.
Can you go back to E for a minute?
Yeah.
So there were these two precipitation models,
Yes.
and the regulation is going to allow them to use whichever one they want.
Yes.
And so how different are they, and is there one that's better than the other?
If I had to pick, I would always use NOAA because NOAA uses up to the most recent. The problem with that is that if you had a couple of years of drought, that factors in too. So your volumes could actually be a little bit less.
So NOAA has a shorter time horizon for the data that
No,
it looks at.
NOAA's goes from, I apologize for not knowing the days, from 1974, all the way to the current. The Northeast Regional Climate Center also uses more refined precipitation data, so they have basically more data points throughout New England that they use for their calculations. NOAA's, while it's more current, is more general in its location. Like they'll only use Durham and Conway, where the Northeast Climate Center will use Durham and Conway and Keene and Portsmouth and more refined locations. So it's kind of a trade-off. I would go with the NOAA simply because it's more current, but you also have less data points and you have to basically assume that you have the same rainfall that Durham has.
Big differences in the title. One is just, all they're concerned with is Northeast Regional. NOAA is national.
Northeast Regional Climate Center is under the National Weather Service, so it is a federal subsidiary, but
I suspect that there is probably a southeast or a mid-Atlantic. There's
Yes.
probably a central, whereas NOAA is looking at the entire contiguous U.S., including Alaska and Hawaii.
so when you would do your,
It's a broader,
if you were to do something to design stormwater systems for Newton, and if you used the NOAA example, you would be using precipitation data from Durham. So I'm pretty local. It's not like you're not using Hawaii's precipitation data.
right, no.
But if you're doing the Northeast climate, you've got more of those data points in New Hampshire. I don't know, there might be one in Plastow as well, but it's closer to Newton in reality.
I guess my question is, is there reason for us to choose one rather than letting them pick which one they want?
Are you more comfortable with broader data or more up-to-date data?
Or saying, we're going to take whatever. The way it's written now is, we'll take whatever the developer wants to use.
What it is saying now is you won't take the rating curves that are the 1894 through
Yeah, right,
1956.
yeah, we'll take whatever of these two.
Yes. That's exactly what it says, so.
Is one of the reasons why they maybe have both of them there is because some engineering firms have already done a lot of the legwork under one of these titles, and so maybe all they have to do is do a little updating and they don't have to start from word go?
you're effectively talking about plugging in a different number. They may know the number offhand, but if you're doing the calculations, it would be just
You have to
delete.
start all over again anyway, new thing.
You would type in 2.68 versus 3.24. That's about the difference.
Okay.
So yes, they may be used to dealing with one rating curve versus another, but we're not talking a large amount of change if they were to swap between the two. They would have to look up something different.
I think
This
Roger's
basically
asking,
gives
should
them
we
the
choose one?
opportunity to pick whichever one is most advantageous to them for the particular year and the particular,
Actually, if you think about it, the two, because now, we are talking federal government here, but NOAA and the Northeast should be close.
They are very similar.
okay,
We're talking like 0.05 inches off.
okay, yes.
Well, you mean, you even have, like, if you use the new precipitation data from the Northeast region, or the most recent from the NOAA, so why don't they both say most recent? Why does the first one say new precipitation data? Shouldn't it say most recent? Both of them say most recent?
Northeast Regional Climate Center isn't necessarily up to the current date. It would be up to like a year or two lag behind.
So new even then. It's kind of vague, new.
Do you want me to ask Mike and get an engineer perspective?
Sure, though I suspect it's like the difference between our master plan and Exeter's master plan.
Right.
Our master plan gets updated every 10 years, Exeter's gets updated every 12.
But if you can get
Yours
new
gets
precipitation
updated
data
every
from that
20
one, but
years.
most current from this
You're
one,
at
it's
20
like,
years.
I think
what's the difference, right?
Your point is more an English grammar kind of a
Yeah,
question.
yeah, what's the difference between new or most recent?
I'm gonna ask Mike.
Okay.
If that's okay.
That's fine.
As I said, I am not an engineer.
Is there a reason why we should have the choice? Or should we just
Well,
decide on one and say, that's the model you're going to use?
That was my basic question, and I have no basis for picking one.
Those are the differences that I know about, is the frequency versus locale.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, that
Yeah,
sounds like a
if you're
good thing
going to
to ask
touch
Mike.
base with Mike, maybe you
Yeah.
can get a little more information on that.
Okay,
And like most New Hampshire, they pick either one of those two things in there.
All the towns I've worked with allow either. I mean, that's not every town in New Hampshire, but it's 4, so.
Okay.
And I couldn't tell you which one gets used more often. So number 12 is actually something you already have in your aquifer district. When someone is storing what are hazardous or regulated substances, so that can be petroleum oil, it can be antifreeze, it can be hydraulic fluid, that they actually have a spill control and countermeasure plan. So if they have a fuel tank that's stored outside, that they have things like secondary containment, it's put over impervious surfaces, it's got a cover from precipitation, it's labeled correctly. If there were to be a spill, that they have the equipment and their staff knows how to clean it up. You guys actually had an oil spill, I think in Newton, about a year ago, and they followed everything that they were supposed to do. It was one of the fuel places down on 108 leaked. They had their spill control and response plan as part of it. They had the booms and the buoys to be able to capture the petroleum. I think it was oil, number 2 fuel oil. But they had the equipment in place. They called DES about the spill. So yes, they did have a spill. Spills happen. But they responded to it and knew how to deal with it, so it minimized impacts to the wetland that it actually got into. That's what number 12 is. It's just having those plans. They're very commonplace. All right, moving on to stormwater for redevelopment. So this is when a site's already been disturbed, they want to come in and put in a new building or expand. What this is saying is that if you are actually improving anything that's got an existing impervious surface coverage, that you are actually not only going to treat the new things that you are adding, you're going to treat some of the stormwater from the existing impervious surface, which means that you are constantly improving the water quality over time when sites come in for a site plan application, or amendment in that case. So that would be if they're expanding their parking lot to a certain degree, if they're actually going to, and B is the toughest one, if they're actually going to do an improvement that doesn't increase the impervious area, under this regulation, unless the cost of the improvement is greater than 30% of the appraised property value. B is a little bit of a difficult one. Not many towns have really pushed B as far as it can go. But when you come in to get a building permit, and if you also are going to require a site plan amendment because of a variety of things that could get you to needing a site plan, you have to evaluate what that change in appraisal is going to do when you come in for that building permit, what the cost is. The reason you do that is because at that point, you are clearly putting money into this property that has stormwater runoff. And there, I put the caveat, there are some cases where you might be able to prove you have no stormwater runoff, especially if it was a newer site. But if it's an older site, you probably have some degree of stormwater runoff. You have the capital cost to be able to go in and actually improve the water quality situation through your redevelopment. That's the reason for that threshold.
Was that in the first draft?
It was. It's possible that was the meeting you were not here for. And then C is any new impervious surface that you're adding would have to comply with the new stormwater standards.
I got a quick question. I think we talked about this before, but I'm not remembering. Once we put this into effect, will this be in effect for any site plans that have already been approved?
No.
Okay,
It will be if
I didn't think so.
something down on Puzzle Lane that has been approved.
Approved but not built yet?
If it's been approved, so anything that you have approved, even conditionally, will not be impacted by this.
Okay.
If they have to come back in for an amended site plan, then this could be triggered. If it's of enough of a change, then it could be
Okay.
triggered, yes.
All right.
So, somebody doesn't do anything with their property for the next 20 years, they'll never have to comply with this. The same with basically every other regulation you have. They don't have to comply for it, it's grandfathered. Second they have to come in, they're subject to your entire site plan regulation book.
Okay.
Actually, I don't think we have any existing plans that have not been started in some format.
Yeah, the big building in the back they haven't started building that yet.
That site plan that we approved had 2 buildings on it. They built one of them.
Right,
Right.
okay.
So it,
Haven't built the big one yet.
they haven't
so-
built the big one yet, but of the approved plan, they have made a substantial piece, 'cause they
Right.
built,
Yes, I
they
mean,
built the little one.
there is a little bit of a lag with, if someone came in for an approval ago, they haven't met substantial and active completion yet, their site plan expires, they want to come back in with the same site plan, then yes, they could trigger this. And that would likely,
Actually, since
that would
that
likely
was-
change their plan, but,
Phase, that large building is the remaining phase.
Yeah.
Therefore,
I thought that the both buildings were in the same phase.
that we'd have to
they were
double
part
check.
of the same approval.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But
However, if they come in and they want to change the purpose or the dimensions or basically anything there,
okay.
it's going to trigger a site plan amendment.
Right.
And therefore, this would kick in.
if anything triggers site plan, whatever the cause, these can be triggered once you adopt them, or if you adopt them.
Okay.
Going on to 1D, this basically just says anything that is not considered redevelopment. Again, that's just the resurfacing of parking lots, landscaping, renovations to the interior, exterior of a building that isn't gonna change any stormwater. This is effectively reiterating for 2 and 3 the requirements of the new development standards. You're gonna have a stormwater management plan, you're gonna meet the performance criteria, and if you need to, you're gonna have a spill control and response plan. 3 is a little bit of an escape clause, so that if you already have 60% existing impervious surface, and this really applies to very small lots, typically non-conforming lots, that you actually can demonstrate that the impervious surface that you have on your lot is as minimal as you can get it, and that you have actually implemented as much low-impact development onto the site as you can practically fit. There is a certain point where there is just finite space, especially on small lots that have already been developed. And there's not enough room for a swale or a rain garden or a detention basin. There are some lots that get to that point. Being able to demonstrate you have done everything you can is a fairly high bar to reach. The lots that really fall under this, you'll know it when you see it. It's a hard, there's not enough puzzle pieces generally for sites to get to that. I've only seen one and it was very clear, yep, they have done everything they can. They've put in pervious pavers, they had a rain garden, they had a detention pond on the one I'm thinking of. It was a 1/4 acre lot that was 80% impervious surface. There was only so much they could do before they started butting up and taking people's property, so. 4 is getting in sites meeting the definition of redevelopment project and having more than the 60% impervious surface. Stormwater shall be managed for water quality in accordance with one of more of the following in order of preference. So this is A, that you are going to treat 100% of the additional impervious surface and at least 30% of the existing impervious surface. So this is, again, you're moving towards having better water quality, if not completely solving it. If the resulting overall greater water quality improvements are done to the maximum extent practicable, provided they treat at least 60% of the entire site that's being developed. And then under 4C, and this is one of those conversation points that you guys had requested, that there be a final escape clause. If someone has tried to do A, tried to do B, that there be the ability for the planning board to approve an alternative. One of those alternatives for water quality that you could consider, and I've never seen this done, but I could see a scenario, if someone were to have a stormwater easement that they were able to negotiate with a neighboring property or something that maybe is just downstream of them, where they're actually able to put in some sort of treatment system or do some other water quality improvement. Maybe they're going to take care of the stormwater from a neighbor's site that happens to be downstream. That actually meets the intent of this, but they are not able to do it on their site for some specific reason. So C is really an escape clause that allows a little bit more creativity. So that's one I do want you to think about. Someone could always come in with all of these, because they are in site plan regulation, with a waiver request, of which you can approve or deny. That's up to you. That's always something that someone could come in with. Sometimes when people come in with waiver requests, they have a reason for it, or they might offer a reason and then, okay, we're not going to meet your regulation, but we are going to do X, Y, and Z.
I was going to say, it would be up to them to explain to us what they wanted to do instead.
Yes.
And actually, I can think of some places in town where something that they could do on the property, just knowing the little tiny spots in town that have certain commercial properties and what have you, they did something that triggered a minor site plan. It triggers this. There are several small parcels in town that are 100% built out.
They don't have any room to do any of it.
Exactly.
Right?
But things that trigger your minor site plan likely will not trigger this. Think about it. So it's adding 5,000 square feet of new impervious surface.
Yeah.
So if they're already completely built out,
They don't have the room to
they
do
don't
that.
have, they can't build out anymore as far as impervious lot coverage. That maybe they can build up, They can't build out.
Okay, yep.
So typically, minor site plans won't trigger this. There's probably a couple of cases, but
So it's in bold because we're supposed to think about whether we want to keep that in there or not?
yes,
Okay.
I could go either way in recommending it or not. I think it would be interesting to see what people come up with, but that's just an intellectual exercise. But
With your example about moving, like, putting on somebody else's property, I thought that's the whole intent of this, is you can't discharge water to somebody else's property, so,
correct.
you know, it's like, well,
There are a few, and actually the wetlands permits sort of do this. One of the options when you're needing to go and get a wetlands permit where you're gonna fill in some wetland, you either have to create a new wetland adjacent to that site or somewhere else on the property. You need to conserve some land someplace else or do a project someplace else, or you can pay money. The paying money option is it's called the Aquatic Resource Mitigation Fund, which goes into the state, and then once the coffers reach a certain point, the state will then redistribute that money towards water quality and wetland restoration projects, where you're taking sort of a bunch of little pots of money and allowing for one big restoration project. In that case, they're doing it by watershed in the state, so it could be something that's not even in your town. Something like this, you would want it to be very nearby, like in the same little creek. It's gonna be an adjacent property, ideally, but it does allow for some creativity. I don't think you're gonna have somebody say, let's not fix Country Pond, we're gonna fix something on the other side of town.
Yeah.
So,
Or it could be, I have 200 acres, you're the 3.5 acre lot next to me, your development, you can't work it, so I allow you an easement so that you put your drainage swale and what have you actually is on my property, because that's the way the flow of water is going, and you pay me for the easement.
effectively, yes. So, if you'll allow me, skip down to the box that's on the bottom of that page. An option to allow for off-site mitigation. This is effectively what we just talked about. Some towns want to allow off-site mitigation. Some don't. Some also feel that because your regulations already allow for off-site mitigation for things like traffic and noise and now potentially stormwater, you sort of already have this in your regulations. So it's whether or not you want to even sort of nod to people developing that off-site mitigation truly is an option, or if you want to minimize that option, don't put it into your regulations. Someone could still ask, and very reasonably you could grant it. This highlights that you might be more likely to be willing to accept off-site mitigation. Or at least that's the argument I've heard from a few towns. So that's another.
My interpretation is if we put in item C, that allows us the ability to consider this. If you put in what's in that box, we're basically telling people that we will consider this.
So items 4C that's above only applies to the redevelopment projects.
Right, well, C is under the definition of, under redevelopment also.
If you have the off-site mitigation, that cannot apply for just the smaller ones.
Oh,
It could
okay.
apply for all redevelopment.
Oh, okay.
4 is for if you have more than 60% impervious surface. So that's kind of a threshold question. So,
To me, quite honestly, C as an alternative plan for redevelopment makes sense. However, I'm not big on the idea, because some people will automatically default to these two options,
it's true.
and I'd rather that they started at least trying to hit the other stuff, because I mean, the idea here is, behind this is improving water quality.
Yeah, but if you're improving water quality, why does it matter whether you're doing it on my land or my neighbor's land who I've bought an easement for.
I mean, ideally, you want them to be as close to each other as possible. The way this off-site mitigation is worded, you want it to be in the same sub-watershed. So it could be at the very top of the watershed, it could be at the very bottom, that could be a quarter mile away from each other, which might be good in some cases and not in others. So that's the one thing you would be losing. But you're gonna think about it, right? But just keep in mind that the 4C only applies to redevelopment when you have more than 60% existing impervious surface area.
And now, if we were to approve the stuff in the box,
It would become 14.
okay?
And don't forget, there's another one on the
Yeah, there's
top of the
another-
next
Yeah,
page.
right.
Yeah, there's
Yeah.
another, there's a 3.
I'm sorry, it wouldn't become 14, it would become, that 13 on line 250 should actually be 5. It would become 6.
Say that again?
Yeah, on line
Oh,
250, it says 13, it should really be number 5. It should not be 13,
so this would be 6.
yes.
Okay.
It's just a numbering problem. And then the box does continue. That basically would give a lot of detail regarding an off-site mitigation, so it's just the property owner's consent. You can't approve an improvement on somebody else's property. People try. People okay with me going on to E? Alright. So this is a stormwater management plan and site inspections. Basically what this says is that the town has the ability to go on during construction and actually inspect the stormwater infrastructure that's being put in. You would require that it be registered, that a legally binding document be filed, obligating maintenance of the stormwater to best management practices. What that means is that on the site plan application, you would actually have, on the site plan itself, on the detail sheet, you would have operations and maintenance instructions be there, and your approval of that site plan would be registered. It would also state that the property owner shall bear responsibility for the installation, construction, inspection, and maintenance of all stormwater management and erosion control measures, as approved by the planning board.
And
This is not getting into the annual or maybe every 3-year inspection scheme that we had talked about last time. This is just basic inspection of infrastructure, particularly as it's being constructed.
Which is usually what the town engineer does.
Yep.
Okay.
F is that stormwater management plans actually be recorded. You would record your notice of decision. These are all things you already do with the site plan. F2 is that you would actually require as-built drawings. So this would be after the stormwater system is constructed. The as-built drawing would be provided to the town. You could choose to record that if you wanted to. Typically, as-bills just stay on file with the town. And then item 3, and I only...
How do you enforce that? You've
How do you
already given them, how do you enforce
as-bills-
getting the as-built?
As-bills are written as a condition of approval. Before you give an occupancy permit, the town
Right.
should require the as-bills, because the building should be, or the infrastructure should be constructed before the code enforcement, or before the building inspector signs that certificate of occupancy, is the as-built been met.
Okay.
Like everything, enforcement is really the,
Well, no, we did it at Sergeant Woods because that's how we discovered they had shifted buildings around from where they were supposed to be.
I mean, you can have a site plan be approved, infrastructure or building, I'm sort of generically, and out in the field, they found ledge in one spot, so they needed to move something 2 feet over, and that's the purpose of the as-built. But because we're talking about smaller scale infrastructure, you want to know specifically where is it located and how big is it and how deep is it. F, number 3, the only reason that this is Bolded is because it really was an addition or a change from the last one, and this is just that if an easement is required for a stormwater plan, that it also requires that the easement, the town shall be able to provide periodic inspections of that if it's just via an easement. That's all that's saying. And again, you would record that notice.
Okay.
So inspection and maintenance in G, this is where I have the largest number of questions for you, or at least I want you to put the most thought, other than the square footage of projects that fall under this, is that who's gonna ensure that all of this is functioning? Because stormwater infrastructure that doesn't function doesn't do you any good. You may as well not have these regulations. So I've put it that municipal staff or their designated agent, I did specify that that could be the code enforcement officer or the town engineer typically, but you could designate a health officer if need be to do that function. That's why that verbiage is in there. Shall be allowed to do routine inspections to ensure compliance with approved stormwater management. So this would be, if there was a problem, you want the authority to be able to go and send somebody out. That doesn't mean you're gonna go out and send somebody out onto everybody's property to look at their stormwater infrastructure all the time. You need that authority to be able to go and do it should you need to. So you do have to do it, this says, with a time agreed upon by the landowner. That's meant to be most landowners are only going to agree with that. If you set up a time, it's not a surprise inspection, unless there were to be some sort of health code violation, then under health code, you could always go and do it.
This section changed a lot from the wording that was in the
Yes
other
and
model.
no. It's a little bit of a order change, and then when we get down into 4, this is about the reporting aspect of this. That changed quite a bit.
Yeah.
So Jen, if we turn around and have the town engineer do it, are we going to collect money previous to, from the developer to pay for this?
So that's a big question that we had last time, so the basic ways of having this inspection and maintenance responsibility, some towns want landowners to report it and just sort of self-report it. Some towns want no reporting and just sort of want to assume that everything's going as it's supposed to. That doesn't, I think, usually work out well. Some want to have a landowner be responsible for reporting it, but they have to do it through someone who's certified to be able to do that inspection, typically an engineer. They can pick whatever engineer they want, but they have to stamp it when they submit an annual report. Or some towns want their town engineer or code enforcement officer going out and doing this because it's seen as being an independent party going out and looking at it. If you were to do that, the problem with that is that then you would likely want to establish, unless you already had a town engineer as a paid staff member, which you don't, establish an escrow account to do those inspections. The problem, stormwater infrastructure, you want to work in perpetuity. If it doesn't work, there's no point in having it.
Right.
So that means maintaining potentially escrow accounts in perpetuity, which a lot of smaller towns simply don't want to do.
Right.
So the basic scheme that we discussed last time, and this is why I have a few questions in here, is that inspections, well, if it's just inspections while it's being constructed, that's one thing. Well, it's an active project. Afterwards, you want the ability to go and inspect if you need to, if it's not functioning. But ultimately, if it's not functioning, it's a violation of its approval. You could go after them with a cease and desist the way you would do any other site that is in violation of their site plan, for whatever is the violation. What this does include is that if there was to be a violation, they would need to, the code enforcement officer would be responsible to report it to both the select board and the planning board. That doesn't mean the planning board has any authority at that point, but they're just reporting it to the planning board. It's really for a cease and desist, it's the select board's function. So that's why that was changed. The one caveat to that, and there's a 10-day period and the corrections aspect, is that in C, the planning board has one card to play. If a stormwater infrastructure is not functioning, you can revoke an site plan approval.
Which means if they have a business, we can shut them down until they fix the problem.
Yes.
Okay.
That is once a project has been approved by the planning board, that is the only card you guys have. It is written in here, so it's very clear. You could do that. Likely, things would never get to that point. You never know. But it's really a select board code enforcement issue. But the only thing I really changed that is, I'm not going to say an oddity, but a little, is that the code enforcement officer would, for stormwater, would actually report it to both boards. The actions you can take are different, but would at least report it to you. You know, I don't know if that's going to always happen, but at least it's in here if you need to have it happen. So that if you want to be noticed when there is specifically site plan violations, let's write it in. If you want it to go the normal course of things, if there is a violation, you might know about it, you might not. We can have it written in that way as well. It doesn't really change what your legal abilities are. So,
Well, if we have the ability to revoke a site plan because they are not fixing a problem that's there, I think we need to know about it.
well, you owe it any recorded site plan, and only site plans that are recorded, you have the ability to revoke for
Right, if
anything.
nobody told us that things weren't getting fixed, then we couldn't do anything about it, correct?
Correct.
And it's good to have it memorialized in the file here so that should something come up 10 years later on that same piece of property, we would be able to go, oh, gee, you know, for three times now that you've failed your inspections and you've had to go back and do something.
It's a last resort. You could legally already take it. Whether you want it memorialized so everybody's on notice from the very beginning of what can happen, I would say not everybody knows that if they get a site plan approved and recorded, that the planning board could then yank that approval if they have good cause. Probably that's not the case, but
I mean, it's much better if the selectmen issue a cease and desist, but
all right, so for G2, basically, applicant bears all financial responsibility. Site development shall not begin before stormwater management plan is received in writing by the planning board. And that's to comply with everything in sections B and C. The municipality retains the right, though accepts no responsibility, to repair or maintain stormwater if property is abandoned or becomes vacant. That's basically because you don't want the stormwater infrastructure to simply cease working and flood onto town roads or adjacent properties. Second, it ends onto a town road or a town property, the town is responsible for that water pollution.
Right.
So it's actually, in many cases, probably better to fix a stormwater infrastructure that's been abandoned for whatever reason than it is to then clean up the water that's coming onto your property.
And get a fine from the state,
EPA,
EPA.
Even worse.
yeah.
and the town can also apply a lien to the property.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. On this, should it say that? It says that the town can do it, but it doesn't say that they're going to get reimbursed by the owner, or that they can seek reimbursement or a lien on the property.
I'll admit, I am not an expert on the laws of when a town can seek a lien or not, which is why I would rather it not go in your site plan regulations. It doesn't mean it doesn't exist as a right for the town to do.
Yeah.
I would like to get an answer to that. Can we do that?
I would think so.
And I think if we can do it, it would be good to say it there.
Right.
I know there are other instances where if we do an improvement, the town is forced to do an improvement to the
Right.
property, yeah, the next day you get a lien.
Yeah,
notice.
well, and I would think you could, and I think it would be, if you're going to say that we have the right to do it,
I
we
mean,
should
we
also
can-
say that we got a right to put a lien on the property.
Which means
for-
charge for it.
Well, if
Yeah.
this is only for abandoned or vacant properties, you're probably not gonna get much luck getting any money, because
Well,
it's probably not, it's
yeah,
vacant.
At some point, the property has some value.
Hopefully.
Put it this way, there's no such thing as abandoned land in New Hampshire for 3 years. Until the property tax bill is not paid for 3 years, there's still an owner.
Right.
The-
But I don't think we're gonna spend $1,000 million like fixing a something, no.
I can try and get an answer for
Yeah,
you.
okay.
I'm not confident I will recommend putting it in your site plan regulations, but I'll try and get an answer
Yeah.
for you.
Well, remember, these site plan regulations are going to require in addition to our policy and procedures manual, when you come to the next one,
The next one,
there's going to have to be some backup in the policies and procedures in order to, depending upon what we choose for language there, and that could be,
Yeah, yeah,
but it's not, the planning board would not be applying the lien, that would be
No.
the board of
yeah,
selectmen.
yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Going on to 4. This is where I have the most questions. That you guys had leaned, no pun intended, towards actually having landowners be responsible for reporting. And it was sort of up in the air if we were going to talk about annual reporting, which I'm going to push for, or reporting something more like every 3 years, that their stormwater infrastructure is functioning as it was approved. Or if it wasn't functioning, what corrective actions have been taken, and then when will it be functioning? So the question really is landowners should be responsible. Should they report annually or once, something more like every 3 years? You could say 5 years. I would not go any beyond 5 years. They should report to the planning board. And I'm going to keep the September 1st of each year that they are reporting. If that's going to be every third year, we can tweak the language to reflect that. The September 1 is just so that any properties that you know have to be submitting, that they're all due on the same date, and it's a little less of an administrative hassle. Okay, so then the next question is, who does the reporting? Should it be by a qualified engineer, or can it just be the landowner? If you require a qualified engineer, that clearly ups the cost of having that report submitted. They can just be a simple report. It can be a one-page form, but you would have an engineer stamp it. That would be the difference. Paying for that stamp will cost somebody a few $100s at minimum.
Right, because then if he's stamping it, he might be the one that wants to come out and look too, to make sure everything.
Oh, he's gonna
Well,
have
but
to.
yeah, that would be a
no
requirement.
engineer worth a stamp is going to put it on something that he hasn't.
Yeah, I mean, the form would be something saying, simple of like identifying the property, the landowner, what is the stormwater infrastructure, identify the site that it's, and the recording number. I certify that this stormwater infrastructure is functioning as designed and per the approved plans on this date stamp. But to do that, they actually do have to go out and look at it.
Right.
If there was a problem, then they would have to attach something else that would say, okay, well, this is what happened, we're in the midst of fixing it, it'll be fixed in 2 months, something like that. That's what that report would be. Ideally, it would take somebody just a few minutes to actually fill the report out, but it would take them some time to go out and look at a site.
Right.
If it's just the property owner, then you're having them sign a document and submit it. And if there is reason to believe that something is not functioning, then you could have the code enforcement officer go out there. The town could actually charge for that time if they wanted to. So there's other courses of making sure it's functioning. You have a professional engineer actually stamp it. Their license is on the line, but it does cost the landowner money, so.
I have a suggestion. I think it should be every 2 years, and I think it should be a qualified engineer, because they're going to look at that and say, yeah, that looks okay. You know, if they don't know what they're doing, they're just going to say, yeah, that looks like it's all right. you know, the water fills it up when it rains and then it drains down, but we have no idea if they know if it's really doing what it's supposed to do.
Or whether or not it's technically clogged and, yeah, it's filling up and it's taking 4 weeks for it to drain down,
Right.
after which the mosquitoes have,
There are plenty of stormwater infrastructures out there that your average person can say, yes, that seems to be functioning correctly. It has drained after 3 days. If it's holding water beyond that and it's a rain garden, it's not functioning. If it's holding it for weeks, the pores are clogged, the vegetation has all died, it's not doing anything. It's just a mosquito pit. You know, so it's not, it's not rocket science, but if your average property owner is going to, A, know to do that and actually do it,
But we're still talking commercial.
we are still
So
talking
I still
commercial.
think every 2 years, maybe rather than every year, and I think it should be an engineer.
Well, especially like I said, if it's a commercial, it could be industrial park where the people are renting their space, so they have no idea what the retention pond's supposed to do, or what this is supposed to do, and what that's supposed to do.
or even
So-
if there's a
They're
retention
renting the
Right,
pond
space,
even
they're
when-
not the responsible
Well,
party.
so that's the whole thing too, right? So it's the landowner or the person that owns
building
that.
owner,
Yeah,
right,
typically,
that
it would
park.
probably be
Right.
whatever management company that landowner has paid to maintain their site.
Right.
Whether that's questionable probably, but
Right. Therefore, it forces them to come and look at it too, because.
Well, that way, I mean, if we have a qualified engineer look at it, we know that that's somebody who knows what it's supposed to be doing, and they can tell if it's actually working.
I mean, by requiring a surveyor or a engineer stamp, they're literally putting their license on the line if they stamp something that is not accurate. Good engineers will not do that.
And if we do every 2 years, then it's like, it's not
Yeah,
every year that they have to spend money.
So,
Yeah, I think if we go with engineers, I would be more inclined to go out to 3 years.
Me too.
Really.
Yeah, I mean, either you have the landowner do it every year, and I agree. A lot of people who own these things are not going to really know what they're signing, because they're not really going to know, even in good faith, that they can sign it and not know that whether it's working right or not.
Or they're gonna copy last year's.
Yeah, right, exactly.
That's what they're gonna do.
Right. So, you know, but if you're going to make them have an engineer come out, because, I mean, really, if it's working well, it's not going to go horribly bad very quickly.
Correct. I mean, if it was something, a catastrophic failure, then you would be able to do corrective action
Right away,
regardless
yeah.
Right,
of a report or not.
right.
And unless it's in the very back of a very big property, you'd probably know too.
Right.
Because depending on what they build, it has different years that they are good for anyway, correct? So,
Yeah, so small rain garden, you need to cut the vegetation back every 2 to 3 years. If it's something more like a cistern that might get filled up, you might only need to suck the solids out of it every couple of years, depending on how much sand and silt is getting into it.
right, and like retention ponds, but you don't want vegetation growing, trees, shrubs growing in the middle of the pond.
It really
either.
depends on location, size, and
Right.
volume that you're talking about, and which type of infrastructure.
Right. So I'd say 3 years.
So just every 3 years, but a qualified engineer seem,
Yeah,
The-
Well,
I'll
if
go
it's
with
for
that.
site plans like industrial parks and stuff like that, yeah. If it's-
well, it could also be multifamily.
Right,
just
yeah,
keep-
but it's a
keep that in
bigger
mind.
development.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I
So,
like-
Not
just one
okay,
little
I'm good
person
for
in the
3 years
house.
Yeah,
with the qualified engineer.
okay.
Because we know the price is gonna keep going up.
Yeah, right.
yeah.
It is not a free endeavor, but it's also not free for the town to accept water pollution.
Right.
All right, so I'll amend 4 to reflect every 3 years with a qualified engineer.
Okay.
And that's it.
I got a question, though. Where in here does it say that if the town has to go out and fix the problem, you're going to have to pay?
It already is in your fines.
Okay.
I only
Where
go-
is that?
It's already in your site plan regulations, where you can collect fines if you need to.
I just have a question back on number 1.
Number 1G or number
Yeah,
1?
G, 1G. So you said the purpose of that was in case it's failing, code enforcement, or somebody has the right to go look, correct?
Correct.
So I have trouble with routine inspection. Shall be granted site access to complete routine inspection. Because to me, routine inspection is something you go do, you go do, you go do. Where you said the intent of this is if something is failing, they can go look at it.
It's a balance of both while it's being constructed, where you already have routine inspections, and also once it's actually installed and the site is functioning.
So we should write both of those, clarify? Is it,
Maybe site access to complete routine inspections
during
during,
building?
Do you want me to
during
just take out the word?
construction?
Do you want me to just take out the word routine? To complete inspections to ensure compliance? Would that-
Because there may be occasions when an adjacent property owner is going, I don't know what happened up there, but all of a sudden I have a stream running through the back of my yard. And it means that the retention pond on the property that was approved has failed in
But that's
some
covered
way.
under
And
something
now all the
else.
water is being channeled into the
Yeah.
former retention pond and onto my property.
Right.
So.
So
can
I
just-
would take out the word routine,
Okay, that's easy enough.
because there might be occasions when, yeah, code enforcement has to go and find out what's wrong.
Yeah.
Do folks feel like they have enough to go and review this in whole for the next meeting?
We're gonna finish the rest of the next meeting, is that what you said?
Nope, this is everything.
Oh, this is it?
Yeah, this
We're
is
on page
Appendix A,
9?
this is
Oh.
just the designer criteria.
Get a headache.
And I do have copies for the Conservation Commission, if
Yeah.
Sandy,
Can
if you
you
maybe
take
want
them?
Yeah, I
to.
can
Yeah.
take them.
Okay. So are you asking if we're ready to put this as a public hearing next meeting?
No, I'm asking if you think you have enough knowledge so that at the next meeting, assuming we don't have any applications, which I don't think we do, we can go through this and sort of get the one last clean version.
Okay.
And at the next
Right.
one, hopefully move it to
So
public hearing.
I
Sure.
can read it closely and decide
Okay,
what are the little things.
sounds
So it
good.
looks very good.
But I would ideally at the next meeting like to be able to move it to public hearing.
Okay,
But obviously if we've got stuff we need to tweak, we'll keep on tweaking it.
okay, great, thank you. Okay. Next item on the agenda is approval of the January 8th minutes.
So moved.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Okay, thank you. Manifests, I have one manifest, operating budget, telephone, and circuit rider, $6,349.35.
Move to pay.
Second.
Although, wait a minute. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Okay, thank you. Sign that in a minute. Correspondence. We have one thing from, we asked the town lawyer to look at the deed for Kinsley, because it has to
Yes.
be, the road has to be deeded over. So there are a few tweaks that have to be done with the language, so we haven't gotten the deed back yet for that. Just want to let you know about
Shouldn't
that.
that be done through the selectman's office so they pay the bill?
I don't know, I just know that
Okay.
Gail had sent it to him to look at, and they did something and sent it back again to look at, to make sure it was okay, and I guess he had another.
Well, I realize we would be deducting it from, I don't know if
No,
there's
it
any
goes-
NEPR.
Yes, there's
Okay.
NEPR. That, it's covered with the NEPR,
Okay.
so you don't have to worry about that. Okay, we have this voluntary lot merger. And It's to merge these two lots together, which is 48 Highland Street, 53, lot 5310, and a back lot, 5313, and they want to merge them together. I checked with the town clerk, and they don't owe any money on their taxes or anything, and they are qualified lots of record, so,
It doesn't create any sort of nonconformity.
no.
Well, that was my question, because it says that in 2008, they added a very large building to the back lot.
Right.
So how big is that building, and where does it sit on the property line? Because
It's a woodshed that's 18 by 36.
that's a pretty big woodshed.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, even if it's on the internal lot line, if it's an existing legal structure, merging the lots would actually eliminate any violation. If it's on the internal lot line.
Yeah, they wouldn't have been able to,
But it doesn't show it on the plan either, like where it is.
no, it never would. They wouldn't show it where it is.
Yeah, there's an actual additional page that,
So this is the piece of land.
Right. There's a page for the land, and then there's a page for the,
What's
where
called
the
the-
house is.
right. But there's also a page called map, which should be showing the house on the land, but it's not accessible for
No, we
some
don't
reason.
have that. Here, all we have is this.
Right.
As long as it's a legal structure, merging the lots doesn't create a nonconformity.
Right.
And I'm just concerned like what actually that building is.
If anything, by merging the lots, it means that woodshed which is not listed on as having any value.
That's $14,000 worth of value.
Sorry,
Wait a minute, the,
sorry.
What is-
I take that,
they-
I
they-
take that back, it is listed.
Yeah, it's listed as being on lot 13.
in
Well, it's an expensive
2018,
wood shell.
removed greenhouse shed structure should have been on 5310.
Right, that should have been on the other one, yeah.
So having a structure on a back lot is normally considered a non-conforming structure. It'd be
But
tough.
actually, it isn't. According to the thing, it's actually on the front lot, it's not on the.
No, that's the other thing. This is.
Yeah, there's
the
two.
green is two
You
things.
flip over the back, no, flip over a
Yeah.
little further.
Right, so the added large building in 2008. And then it says 2011, they didn't add any new structures.
No, but
2018, they removed the greenhouse shed structure, should be on the other map.
Yeah,
But
that's
but
right. So-
But
so
this
it-
is still here. That building is still there. I think they had.
No, all they did, all she did was, I guess she put it on the other,
Because, I don't know if you should go, a site, we should go by and do a site walk or whatever, but
They didn't demolish the structure.
right, all they did was
removed
move it from one
that
card
sheet
to the
the
other.
Right,
sheet.
so it's not on the back lot, it's actually on the lot with frontage on Highland.
Right, right.
Right, because it's listed.
In the back part of the lot that has frontage on, so it's really
Oh.
a real non-issue.
Then there's not a non-conformity
Right,
to
there's- yeah,
conform.
right,
It's already conforming.
so,
But they still show that building on this other lot.
Yeah.
On the
No,
4-acre lot, it has
From
a
the
building worth
dimensions, they're two
14,000.
different buildings.
Right,
The one that was
that's
on
the-
the back structure was 18 by 36.
this one here, this
On
barn
this-
is 30 by 44.
Yeah,
And that's the one right beside the house.
Right,
right,
Right.
that's, right.
That's where the grain store was.
and there's one that is 34 by 48. Or sorry, that's an addition.
Right, so the 134
That's probably this.
by 38
Right.
is the one that's on the back lot.
Right.
It's 18 by 36.
As long as the structures were legal at the time of their construction,
Bless you.
Bless
then
you.
this lot merger would not change any conformity or non-conformity.
Right.
Because you
Move
don't,
to-
now you have more than that many structures on one parcel of land, where before it was two
But
parcels.
but the structure is legally existing in its location. It can
Right.
continue to exist. The lot changes would not make non-conforming lots. The
Right.
structures would still be allowed to stay. It's kind of like if you had an old farmhouse that was really close to the road. The old farmhouse can stay no matter what you do to the lot, property lines. It's allowed to remain there.
And it's not like he's subdividing and suddenly remember we had the one where
Oh, down, yeah,
it was
it's the
too-
other way,
it was
yeah.
too close to the lot line.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So I will move to authorize the chair to sign the voluntary lot line merger.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Sandy?
No, I voted aye,
Okay, sorry.
sorry.
Thank you.
You see what this is? They have an intent to sell.
I'm sorry?
They have the intent to sell.
I don't know.
Yeah, they do.
They didn't say, and
No, I know,
it's
I
not
know.
our business to ask them, I guess, but I would assume that
I would
it
assume
could
they
be
would.
because now they've got frontage.
Well, they can't make a non-conforming lot. Right? They can't leave a landlocked piece.
They would have to build a road.
Oh, yeah, oh, I know that,
Yeah.
Yeah, but they
Right.
can't get a road here.
right. Okay.
Well, Old Lower Road cannot be used as frontage.
Right.
Now you can't subdivide, or you have to do something with it.
You would
They
have,
get
you would
merged
have,
back
you
together
would have to
anyway, yeah.
build a road to
Right.
gain frontage for more than one lot.
Right.
Right.
Correct. So, okay, there's nothing more on the agenda?
Move to adjourn.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Thank you.